Welcome everyone to the Green New Deal podcast, part of your favourite environmental platform, GND Media. I'm Adam Williams and I'm here tonight with my eco-brother in arms, half man, half mixing deck, producer Andrew Glassford. How you doing, matey?
I'm Grandad, how are you?
I'm okay, pal, yeah. I'm okay. You been up to much recently?
Well, just, carrying on in fits of despair and anguish as the world travels in a direction I don't really like. But I have been finding myself buoyed by Bernie Sanders being in the country and just, him putting various journalists to right, I found the last week. It's been very weird. It's like the kind of reverence he's been given, considering, his stances. I think if you said it from a British politician, it'd be very different. But
yes,
and then we had
too true.
We had Labour's announcement of the 5 missions, and there's this whole thing about wanting to be a green energy superpower, which I'm not sure about the language of that, but I'm very much for the full electric green grid by 2030. So, some specks of light on the horizon.
Okay, you feeling good then, mate? Yeah.
Yeah, as bright
Good
as this
stuff.
shirt for an audio podcast. People don't need to know.
Okay, so as a show that is 100% dedicated to the climate crisis, more often than not, we will focus and discuss specific issues within the climate movement and the scientific community. But every now and again, it's good to get a bird's eye view of events, to zoom out and look at the whole and see whether collectively we are slowly attaining our goals or whether the path we are on is still fundamentally leading us off a cliff. For a discussion of this kind, I'm delighted to say that we are joined today by Professor, columnist and author James Dyke. James, thank you so much for coming on the show, mate.
Many thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yeah. So James, you're someone who's been working in climate science for a number of years. But for those in our audience that are not familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what areas you specialise in?
Okay, well, about 10 years ago, I was studying life on other planets because I was doing astrobiology research. And my main interests were around how does life on a planet affect that planet, so planetary coevolution. And it's not a big leap, well, at the time, it wasn't a big leap for me to consider how a particular species, Homo sapiens, was affecting a particular planet, which is our home planet, planet Earth. And I came to the conclusion that some of my research interests, although I was really passionate about the science I was doing, it probably wasn't very useful in the context of averting a climate and ecological crisis. So for the last decade and a bit, actually, I've reorientated my research into more sustainability science, let's say. So it's a kind of a blend of the earth science, but also the social sciences, and maybe in some instances beyond science. That's my interest in journalism, science outreach and engagement.
And was he a moment, or was he a book that you read? Was he something you saw on the news? What made you think, well, I think I need to transition now from space to Earth because of something called the climate crisis?
I think it's been a long, slow burning issue. I remember, it must be 20 something years ago, the first time I was in the tropical rainforest and I came across deforestation, and the first times I was diving on coral reefs and came across coral bleaching and coral destruction. But it wasn't until quite a few years later, I think I've had it's a bit like falling down a flight of stairs. It feels like every now and again there's a kind of a regular epiphany. One moment, if we're talking about the work I was doing on astrobiology, is when I was living in Berlin, and I remember there was it was one of the moments when you realize that our civilization is maybe just fundamentally unsustainable. I was walking down the road past a big construction site, big cranes, concrete pillars reaching up into the sky, and I was in a sports store, and they were selling shoes. And one way they were selling shoes was to get people to run on a treadmill. And the treadmill had they're quite common now. The treadmill's got a big TV on it, and you could run in potentially, anywhere, I suppose. But the video that it had was somebody was running down the road, and the road was the road outside. And they produced a video of the environment outside, which allowed people to run inside to try out the new shoes. And then also I saw that same treadmill in another gym. And it's in a strange way, it kind of encapsulates some of the absurdity of what we're trying to do by a kind of a simulation of reality in an air-conditioned control environment and all the energy and materials and resources involved in that, as opposed to just, well, why don't you just go and run outside?
Yeah.
This is what terrifies me about, this is going to sound almost conspiratorial, but like kind of the emphasis around artificial intelligence and alternate reality and the metaverse as like, this is a new frontier we're going to push into, when it's like, well, our own world in itself has got a lot of problems we maybe could be focusing on with all these people with all various computer talents could be working on that, versus launching software systems that don't have the technology to demonstrate legs, as far as I can tell from how the metaverse launched a couple of months ago. So like, yeah, the kind of the simulacra of the virtual reality, like, yeah, absolute madness.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually, if you think about all the guests we've had, Andrew, and I do ask this question frequently, you know, what was the moment that made you realise just how serious the climate crisis was and for you to get involved in it? It seems strange now that nobody's actually mentioned due to the absurdity of an event. So I do find that really interesting, that it was something absurd that really made you sort of think, you know, this isn't sustainable. You know, usually it's something like, oh, because, you know, we went fishing and there was no fish there, or there was some event that made, you know, that meant that climate change was right in my face. But yeah, I just find that quite refreshing actually, that it was something absurd that made you think that, yeah, actually we're in trouble here. Now, you wrote a book, James, called Fire, Storm and Flood, The Violence of Climate Change, which is a photographic record of the violent aspects of climate change. I found that quite unique as well, that it's a photographic record. Can you just tell us the thought process behind that book and the journey that you went on making it?
Well, the motivation for the book was to try and tell the story of climate change, not just for today, but over deep time. So pretty much since the origins of the Earth, because the Earth's climate has always changed. And so the very nexus of the idea was to respond to that kind of classic climate change denier or skeptic point. You know, the climate's always changed. Why should we be worried about climate changing right now? Well, if you know anything about Earth history, you'll know many of the mass extinction events on Earth have been associated with climate change and quite violent climate change.
Yes.
So the fact that we are producing climate change, which might be unprecedented for, I don't know, 2.6 million, and depending on how else you might want to evaluate it, maybe 55 million years, should be cause for great concern, because certainly 55 million years ago, there was a significant extinction event. And how do you tell that story? Well, it's obviously going to be very data rich, potentially. There's going to be lots of facts and figures and science and things like this. And that will interest maybe 0.1% of the population. So we thought, well, we could get more engagement and interest if we tell it in the story of images and photos. And so some of the photographs would be representing past extinction events, maybe, you know, volcanism and runaway climate change and ocean acidification, and other images would represent or capture climate change that we're seeing right now. And then the last third of the book was potential climate futures. So, you know, if we do get our act together and rapidly decarbonize, what could climate look like over the rest of this century? But then also look far into the future, because many people don't really understand. Oh, this sounds a bit patronizing, I know, but they don't really understand that the changes that we put into the climate already are going to take maybe on the order of about 100,000 years to really unfold. Everyone thinks about warming by the end of this century, but because we produce so much imbalance in the energy budget for the Earth, it's going to take about 100,000 years for that system to go back to what it was, right?
Yeah.
So there's a really interesting thing you can play with in terms of deep time and the deep changes that we've seen in the Earth long before there were humans, and now the deep changes that we're putting on the Earth system in a matter of centuries.
Yeah, and is there sort of a favourite photo in that book, and is there a reason why it's your favourite? Is there something that really captures something that you think is vitally important with the message you were trying to portray?
Well, it's not, I mean, look, to be honest with you, it's not an easy book to read because it's certainly the second part when we're talking about contemporary climate change. It was actually quite hard to write, because as I was writing it, I was thinking of, well, what's a good example of a wildfire? What's a good example of an extreme weather event?
Yeah.
And we were working with a really good picture researcher, and then they would find images and then we'd have a discussion about it. and they would agree that's a good one, and then there'd be another record-breaking wildfire in California or something. And you think, okay, well, are we going to update it? At what point do you draw the line?
Yeah. Then Australia and so
Well,
on
exactly,
and so
yeah,
forth. Yeah.
So it was quite challenging to know when do you stop, but then also this book has just become a kind of remorseless kind of assault that just leave you completely despaired. So in answer to your question, then I think my favorite photo is probably one that's a remote sensing image. It's a photograph taken not from I think it is actually a remote sensing image from a satellite, and it's basically looking down on the Nile. And it's a really beautiful image, I think, because you can see the course of the Nile all the way towards the Fertile Crescent, and you can see the river, but really what you can see is the green either side of it.
Yeah.
It's this kind of lovely emerald strip across the desert, which just really encapsulates how limited the human ecological niche is. And that was one of the regions that saw the first advent of farming. Farming kind of spontaneously emerged about 11,000 years ago in a number of different places on the earth, and along with it, then ordered and complex civilization. And it just really does represent, I think, that image, how narrow the kind of ecological niche is for not just humanity, but for our civilization. So it kind of stands as a metaphor for our current climate epoch, the Holocene. And what we are currently doing is driving the environment, driving the climate system outside of that relatively stable climate state that we've had for the last 11,000 years or so. So it kind of stands for a number of things, but also I think it just looks really beautiful because it's kind of life in an otherwise barren environment.
It's kind of a good representation of like the idea of like a circular economy, or the way that like Kate Raworth kind of demonstrates that in a donut economics. That thin strip in between absolute destruction of society versus destruction of the environment at the same time. In the process of making this book, then I imagine, well, there's a lot of cynicism in the world, and people would argue a kind of a fair bit of like people being desensitized. Like they see kind of stuff on television and they feel that, well, that's a million miles away, or it's not happening right now. Was this book you trying to kind of be a recipe against that? Some kind of try to go, how do we demonstrate this in a way where it doesn't feel like it's just 1,000 miles away? Or do you think can you combat that like with more images, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think what we need to do is better communicate or contextualize what climate change or climate and ecological change or the climate and ecological crisis means.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the scientific community, the academic community, has done a very good job of contextualizing it in the context of mid or end century targets. Which most people are pretty ambivalent about, warming by the end of the century. Well, I'll be dead, right? My kids might not be, my grandkids. And so then we kind of frame it in the context, well, it's about our children, it's about our children's children. And really that is a disservice to what is happening right now, because climate change is affecting a significant fraction of humanity. And it's not just people far, far away. Tens of thousands of people died. There were excess deaths through European heat waves, and people will be dying in the United Kingdom as a consequence of extreme weather events. So somehow we need to connect that with. Unfortunately, it's still the case that in many media representations, extreme weather it doesn't have any sense of danger or risk. The number of times you'll see a front page of the newspaper and they're talking about a heat wave, and the image they'll use is people on Brighton Beach, or people playing at a fountain, or drinking beer, enjoying the hot weather. And it's understandable, given our kind of variable climate, that when we do have hot weather in the United Kingdom, it's something almost to celebrate.
Yes, yeah.
But rapidly, I think people are beginning to realize that it's not. It's actually a creeping sense of dread associated with these extreme weather events, because it kills people, and the intensity of these extreme weather events is going to increase. So there's an awful lot we can do thinking about the images that we use and the stories that we tell about climate change. It's not far, far away. It's here right now. And then also at the same time, we need to make sure that we don't feel, or don't end up with people feeling completely disempowered and despondent and falling into despair. So it's here, it's real, it's now, and there's everything that we can do about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I remember when we had the 40-degree heat last year, and I actually saw somebody collapse in the centre of Manchester with heat exhaustion. You know, something that you just would not expect to have ever seen in Manchester. So, you know, it is creeping slowly towards us, isn't it? Now, James, as I mentioned in the intro, you know, you're someone who, you know, I've invited on because I would like to get a sort of a bird's eye view of things, an overview of what you think is going on with regards to the targets that we've set. So last year we had the two COPs, one that everybody knows about, one that nobody ever knows about. It's just as important, the biodiversity one, which was in December. We've had the IPCC report out now for a couple of years. I know there's something happening in March with that, some sort of update or a new one. You know, we know where we are now in regards to the data, in regards to what climate scientists are saying, what indigenous communities are saying, discussions around climate justice, which are really important. As somebody who is a sort of an expert in a number of fields, but you not only speak to the experts, but you're a commentator, you're an analyst. Where do you see us in relation to the lofty goal? Well, they're not even so lofty goals, really, but the goals that we've set ourselves, you know, even way back in Paris, you know, which was held up at the time as being groundbreaking, now kind of seems quite milquetoast. Where do you see us, James, in relation to the targets we've set, to the movements that's going on, to the things that have happened? You know, where do you see us?
Well, we're on a journey, and I don't know where that journey is going to. And I think we should all be a bit suspicious for anyone who claims they know, because obviously the journey is going to depend on what the Earth system does, and there's still a bit of uncertainty about it. But then also, of course, the largest uncertainty is what we are going to do about it. So you mentioned the Paris Agreement, and yes, at the time it was considered to be a surprise success. I know many people in the climate science community were surprised that there was binding, as far as they can be, agreements to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, which has now come to be interpreted as 1.5, which is where 1.5 is still alive, and where the both the climate policy and also climate activism has kind of focused on is to try to hold the line to limit warming to no more than 1.5. But, you know, many years before Paris, there was the aspiration that we would limit warming to no more than not a temperature limit, but a concentration of CO2, something like 350 parts per million, in order to avoid dangerous interference. And in between that concentrations aspiration and Paris, there was probably the assessment done that beyond 1 degree Celsius, climate change would probably be dangerous for a significant fraction of humanity. And that journey of policy, or the translation of what the science is telling us in terms of what's happening to the climate and to what extent we should be worried about it, is a kind of managed retreat. Because back in 1988, when Jim Hansen gave his famous testimony to US Congress, and he was talking about avoiding dangerous concentrations or dangerous interference in the climate system, we could have limited to no more than 350 ppm. We could have limited to no more than 1 degree Celsius with relatively modest rates of decarbonisation, you know, a couple of percent a year or something, you know, a kind of a managed transition. And of course, that didn't happen, and it's never happened. And so there's been a kind of a series of revisions of what we should do and how we are going to do it in the light of ever increasing emissions. You know, so the majority of CO2 that's in the atmosphere has been put into the atmosphere since Jim Hansen gave that landmark testimony, right?
Yeah.
So it's a strange journey in which there's increasing understanding and awareness, and then alarm of what we're doing, and yet an acceleration of those impacts and acceleration of greenhouse gas emissions. So where we are today is probably warming that's exceeded 1.2. I mean, it depends on how you measure it. Is it 1.2? But it's 1.3. We're probably a few years away from a annual average temperature exceeding 1.5, but then it'll probably go back down. But then we're probably within about a decade or so, maybe within a decade of just exhausting any available budget for 1.5. Now, the situation that we're in is one in which policymakers have still yet to recognise that. They've still yet to say we're not going to limit warming to 1.5. they're still yet to recognize that not just efforts on mitigation, but adaptation need to be massively ramped up because more and more people are being exposed to dangerous climate change. And instead, what we're getting is a sort of a phony war, which on the one hand, we're saying 1.5 is still alive, we've got to hold the line. But in the absence of any of the kind of radical policies that would actually do the job. Now that could be, post-growth, degrowth. There's a entire ecosystem or zoo of economic and political theory that you could apply.
Yeah.
I tried to remain agnostic about it.
Mm-hmm.
And instead just point out that whatever you think or however you think we could limit warming to no more than 1.5 or even 2, it's not happening. And so instead we are kind of telling ourselves, or perhaps deluding ourselves, that we'll limit warming to 1.5 or 2 with probably large-scale carbon removal. And there is, maybe something we want to talk about in a bit in more detail, because I tend to talk about it quite a lot. But when that probably doesn't materialize in time, then we're going to be having the geoengineering kind of discussions. And then when that doesn't materialize in time, then we're probably going to have other kind of discussions.
We'll go back to the Elon flying to Mars kind of discussion, I imagine, after that bit.
Well, I think Elon's going to be on his private island somewhere in the South Pacific or something with his private army and his bunker. Maybe we'll get to Mars one day.
It's just unfortunate that you can't eat money. Yeah, well, just as you kind of brought it up, I was going to ask you about the kind of work you've done on carbon markets and carbon credits and this kind of whole space. You've written about it a few times on your blog and other works. We spoke to Daisy Dunn a couple weeks ago from Carbon Brief, and she was at COP15, and we were both very sceptical about offsets and carbon markets. People that don't know what they are, could you briefly explain? And then where do you kind of fall down on the various shades of carbon markets?
Well, what typically happens now is I give a scientific and largely detached explanation of carbon offsets and carbon removal, and then I'll give an editorial slant on it. So maybe I'll just reverse that and begin with it's a scam. Everyone knows scam. It's designed in order to facilitate and perpetuate fossil fuel use.
Yep.
It's a component in a phony war that we're meant to be battling against the climate and ecological crisis. Okay, so that's out the way. Right?
Yeah,
so you know where I'm coming
from. What you really
from.
think.
You bang on the money, mate. Go on.
So the idea of an offset is that you can continue to emit greenhouse gases, typically CO2, through, let's say, burning coal in a thermal power station or kerosene in a passenger aircraft. But the carbon dioxide that will be emitted through that is offset by carbon dioxide that will be absorbed somewhere else. And that somewhere else could literally be on the other side of the world, because it could be through a tree, which is growing in a temperate forest or a rainforest. And the argument is that if you can promote that tree growth or that removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through some other means, and there is an entire constellation of different methods which are being proposed, then you can continue to make that emission. So this is where the idea of carbon neutrality comes from. Yeah. Now, obviously, I'm very skeptical about it, but I can't just sort of sit on the sidelines and point at people and call them out about this, because in many instances it is motivated with the best of intentions. Because so I'll give you its most positive interpretation as far as I can see. You've got an organization that wants to get to net zero or want to have no overall climate impacts by some particular date. People talk about the middle of this century, 2050, because that seems to be something to do with Paris. It's probably much sooner for richer nations. It could be as early as 2035 or something. But let's just say they want to rapidly decarbonize. And that is a part of a story that collectively humanity needs to decarbonize really, really quickly. Yeah. But for things like aviation, there are no alternatives to kerosene in wide-body passenger jets. I mean, there are maybe electric vehicles that might be coming, or hydrogen vehicles, but they're not going to materialize anything like at the speed at which we need them to. So then what do? You stop flying, you just completely stop aviation, or do you work to decarbonize as quickly as you can, and then those residual emissions, the things that you just can't decarbonize completely, so it could be aviation, could be steel, could be cement, you offset by growing more trees. So afforestation, for example, mass tree planting, or habitat restoration, like reintroducing or recovering peatlands or some other kind of
like
carbon
seaweed
thing.
farming, for example.
Seaweed farming, and there are many different ways that have been proposed, and people are currently attempting to, in order to remove carbon dioxide. Now, the problem is, of course, is that when you monetize that, when you put that into a carbon credits market,
Mhm.
it's just a recipe for either absolute grifting and fraud, right? Like, let's be honest, or best intentions that just don't really translate into anything. So there was a recent investigation by, it wasn't just the Guardian, but a Guardian newspaper was importantly involved in it. And they concluded that probably about 90% of all carbon offsets just don't really do anything. In terms of, does it remove carbon from the atmosphere? No, it doesn't. And I'm sure, in fact, some of them probably increase it kind of inadvertently. So that's where we kind of are with the current state of offsets, I would argue.
Just before I bring ads back in, so I work for a local council on climate, and we've had our carbon inventory done, and we've been given trajectories from various kind of consultants telling us how we can decarbonize, and every kind of set of people I talk to, they all say that there's going to be this last hard bit of decarbonization that's going to have to be offsets. Now, in the context of what you're telling me, that means that all these people are basically saying that there's going to at least be a residual carbon, like CO2 emissions, out of any kind of system we've got going at the moment. Is that last hurdle like insurmountable, like as we're speaking right now, or is it a case of, has the grift got so far into people's thinking about climate is that it has to stay in there somewhere?
I mean, that's such an interesting question. It's one that I have with quite a few individuals and organizations. So I'll give you just a kind of a generic representative sort of conversation. It's the organization is working hard to decarbonize, and they can demonstrate progress.
Yeah.
They can say this year their emissions were less than last year, and they've got a trajectory whereby they would have, I don't know, certain 50% emissions reductions in the next 5 to 10 years or something. But then there's the stuff in which they are really struggling to see how they could completely remove. So they might have a district heat and power system, which is currently powered by gas, and they've spent an awful lot of money on it.
Yeah.
They might have quite a bit of international travel, which they consider to be only able to happen through aviation. So there's always bits and pieces that they just say, look, we just can't remove those emissions. And so then what should happen is you ask them, so why are those emissions impossible to remove? And they're not impossible to remove. What they are they're telling you that there are certain things that you can do in your organization, and there's certain things that you won't.
Yeah.
Certain core operations, like maybe certain missions that the organization has got, that you have concluded you will not change. So, for example, international travel or aviation. I mean, you could remove them, but you're not going to.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the reason you're not going to is because of reasons. Now, when you get down to that level of kind of analysis, it gets very difficult for the organization, because the organization or the individual wants to maintain that they want to be carbon neutral, but they want to also preserve certain things. For example, and this is perfectly reasonable, I guess, they want to make a profit, or not even want to make a profit. They want to increase the size of their market share. They want to increase revenue or sales, or in an international educational context, they want to bump up the number of international students they've got, like in a university or something. Now, my point to them is, rather than have those more difficult conversations, isn't it just so much easier to say, well, we'll just offset it, right? We'll do as much as we can, and then the stuff that's really, really hard, we'll plant some trees, or we'll fund some other kind of offsetting scheme. And now that there are so many carbon offsetting schemes and organizations and companies to choose from, it's a relatively easy kind of decision to make, in which you can allocate a certain amount of resources to it. So you can basically pay to offset those emissions, which is, even though there's obviously a cost, it's not free, it's much, much easier to do that than the deeper introspection about, well, how much are you willing to change in order to reduce to zero your climate impacts.
Yeah, well, I was going to just go back to what you said, James, about it being done with the best of intentions. And is it because the premise is false? So people are going off the premise with the best of intentions in regards to carbon credits and carbon offsetting, but it's the actual premise itself that this thing is going to essentially save the world that is false. Is that what you meant by they're doing it with the best of intentions?
Some organizations, absolutely, and some individuals, if you wanted to buy a plane ticket, you have the opportunity to offset. And so you can add extra money onto your ticket in what is essentially an altruistic act, because that's not going to bump you up. You're not going to get business class or champagne or anything. You're just paying. Now, some people say, well, actually, it's not altruistic because it's a guilt tax, because now you can fly and enjoy the experience of flying a bit more because you don't have to feel guilty about it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you what the percentage is, right? How many people are undertaking this in best faith. I can tell you that, in my opinion, there are organizations which are absolutely using it as an opportunity to greenwash.
Yeah.
And I'm quite happy to mention organizations such as Shell and their Sky Zero scenario, which they seriously proposed that by the middle of this century they would offset their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. So the scope 3 emissions would be
all three.
The scope 3 emissions would be the carbon dioxide released by all the oil and gas they are going to continue to pump out of the ground, and they would offset it all by planting trees, essentially. So when they published that, when they wheeled this thing out, it was widely ridiculed, and rightly so, because it's just a preposterous notion.
Yeah.
And then collectively, when you add up all the individual organizations, corporations, proposals to offset their emissions by tree planting, you realize there's literally not enough land on Earth. You'd have to be planting.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what they're going to use Mars for, tree planting on Mars.
Yeah. Well, that's been proven now, hasn't it? That there's not enough land for all these carbon offsets.
Well, not if you want to continue to grow food, not if you want people to live on them. And we are already seeing these sorts of offsets as precipitating a form of kind of neo-colonialism where I, a rich, relatively speaking, rich white man, can offset my emissions by flying around the world, by buying up land in low latitude tropical regions, right?
Yeah.
And that's not their land anymore. That's not their forest. That's my forest, because that's my carbon that I'm putting into it. And so, no, you can't obviously exploit those forestry products, but also you can't use that land for farming.
Yeah.
And the other issue that we've got with the kind of mass planting of monoculture that would be involved in some of these afforestation schemes, yes, they're going to take land out of production for food. They're also going to consume potentially significant amounts of water.
Yeah.
And so one of the so we were talking about the Paris Agreement earlier, and one of the savior technologies really that emerged very quickly after Paris was the notion of bioenergy carbon capture storage, because it was, at the time, it was practically impossible for these kind of climate scenarios to find mitigation pathways to limit warming to no more than 1.5. And so when you've got the need to remove significant amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, they said, okay, what we'll do, we'll just plant a load of trees, like, I don't know, maybe 1 trillion, and then burn them in power stations instead of coal, and then capture the CO2 from the chimneys.
This is the Drax formula, isn't it?
And Drax has done very well from that. So, the thing about Drax is that we UK taxpayers are funding it to the tune of, tens of millions of pounds each year for its accelerated destruction of old growth forests in North America.
I was at a conference with Drax last year, and I went to watch them speak about their product, inverted commas, and there was a lady on the panel who was kind of asked about, like, well, doesn't kind of make sense to me that you plant trees, then burn them, and then capture the carbon. It feels like it really a very backwards way of trying to do this. And we were told, or the lady was told, that you can't let ideological positions get in the way of progress. Which is like, I'm not sure if common sense is an ideological standpoint, but maybe that's for a different podcast to discuss. I just thought it was the Kool-Aid had been drunk so much, it was absolutely bonkers. I don't know how that place is staying open outside. I guess what you're talking about, it's like part of this wider system of the carbon credits situation as well, to a certain degree, of this idea that we'll use the trees to make up for this massive shortfall in our ability to decarbonise.
Yeah, we're just using the biosphere to try to mop up not just the pollution that we've produced, but the pollution that we will continue to emit.
Yeah.
And the biosphere is under onslaught from, about 10,000 years of human farming already. I mean, there's very little land that's not affected by humans, ice-free land. We use it for farming or, for living on. And the notion that there is all this extra land that we can just repopulate with trees or restore in some other ways to draw down carbon, it's based on like a simple idea. If you've got some degraded land and you let it recover back into a forest, if it goes through those successional stages, it sequesters carbon, right? And that's great. But the way I put it is that planting trees doesn't plant a forest. It needs time. So if we had 100 years to do habitat restoration, it's going to be great. It's going to increase biodiversity. It's going to lock in carbon. It's going to stabilize soil. It's going to have beneficial impacts on the hydrological cycle and reduce soil erosion and reduce flooding. All these kind of things.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're looking what kind of nature-based solution can we throw at the climate crisis in the next 5 years. So it's a kind of industrial scale intervention in the biosphere, which is already under onslaught from multiple other factors. So it's makes it worse. So we go from a climate crisis and attempts to mitigate that by accelerating the ecological crisis.
Now, for me, in terms of like there being more effective offsets, would you say people throwing money into energy production, so whether it be like solar and wind and using that as an offset, does that make more sense than other projects that are going to be tree planting based, or does that have its own pitfalls as well, like the displacement of energy in the network?
Yeah, well, it's a really complicated. Maybe
Especially
it's just
for a Friday night.
Maybe it's just the Pandora's box, because then you end up. One of the problems that we've got with offset credits is that there are offsets which you could argue. Okay, I mean the one that everyone understands. I'm going to plant a tree.
Yeah,
maybe it's in my garden or maybe somewhere else. And over the next 50 years, that tree will store, I don't know, like 500 kilograms of carbon or something. And you can say that's my budget. So over that time scale, over the next 50 years, I'm allowed to emit that carbon because the rate in which I'm producing it is the rate in which it's being stored. A significant fraction of carbon offsets are what we call deferred emissions reduction, i.e., there is a forest at the end of my road and I've bought the land. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut down that forest and burn all the trees. And in doing so, I'm going to release, I don't know, maybe 100 tons of carbon. I'm not going to do that. And instead, what I'll do is I will create a carbon credit to the value of 100 tons of carbon and then sell it on the market. So then somebody, a corporation or individual, can buy that. And in doing so, they will stop the emissions that would have been produced if I was going to cut down the forest. Now, of course, that hasn't removed any carbon from the atmosphere. It hasn't reduced. I mean, the trees will, as they continue to absorb, but really that's not what I'm selling. I'm selling 100 tons, right?
Yeah.
That's what the carbon credit is worth. And when you look into the carbon credit market, you'll find a significant fraction of it is essentially promises to not destroy the biosphere and release significant fractions of CO2, right? So it's not actually removing anything. What we're saying is we're just not going to make it much worse, right?
It sounds like a ransom when you play like that. It sounds like a ransom. Yeah,
it's laughable, but this is how it works. Now, then you've got the problem. Well, how do you prove that you were gonna? Maybe I had no intention of cutting that forest down at all. Maybe I don't even own the forest. Maybe somebody else owns that forest. Maybe I've created a carbon credit, right? I mean, and then somebody else has as well. Or after I mint my carbon credit for 100 tons, somebody else comes along or some point in the future, I sell the forest and then someone does cut it down and burn it, right? Because remember, once you've made that commitment for 100 tons, that's a commitment you need to keep for thousands of years, essentially forever, because the lifetime of CO2 in the atmosphere is thousands of years. So one of the, I suppose, the biggest drivers for skepticism around nature-based solutions, including afforestation or reforestation, is that trees die and they burn down. A couple of years ago, there was a large forest that was being used to offset Microsoft's emissions, and it burnt down in a Californian wildfire, right? So
Christ.
these things are really vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so
which is going to happen again and again and again.
Yeah, the watchword now is durability. You need to get that carbon out the atmosphere and you need to put it somewhere where it's going to stay essentially forever. So that's when they think about geological storage or sequestration, basically putting it into the Earth's crust where it will have to stay forever. So trees, it's not the flavor of the month anymore.
Yeah. So James, you know, what we're really saying is that the system as it stands is not the system that is going to save us from ourselves, essentially. Now, what that might mean is that we could change the system as is, we can tweak it, we can bring in new policies, but there is an argument on the left, especially, and I'm on this side, that, you know, it's the system itself that is the issue. And when I say the system, I'm talking about capitalism. Where do you see yourself on the spectrum of whether you're saying this is an issue of capitalism that cannot really be fixed, we need a new system? Are you of the belief that there's still things we can do within this system that are realistic and that could potentially save capitalism from itself?
Some people do argue, or at least make the observation, or however you want to frame it, that extractivist capitalism is at the root of this problem. And unless you try and address those fundamentally destructive elements of extractivist capitalism, then it's, you know, earlier on I talked about a phony war. Well, then we might just be in appeasement, you know. Others might want to say or argue that there's an important colonial element to this, because it's largely the case that it's been the colonizing global north that's extracted wealth from the global south and imposed a kind of fossil fueled capitalist regime across the rest of the world. And I mean, how far you want to go down that sort of theoretical or intellectual journey, I don't know, but it certainly, I think we can all agree on the fact that United Kingdom was pretty much the first country to industrialize. It led the world into the Industrial Revolution. Until relatively recently, was still one of the top cumulative emitters of CO2, just because we got a head start on everyone. What I think people will perhaps realize, and maybe some of them are realizing right now, is that it's very, very hard to continue with an extractivist, growth-based global economy at the same time as avoiding dangerous climate change or even catastrophic climate change. It's like trying to keep up with a treadmill that's running faster and faster. But unfortunately, in the context of policy of pretty much all political parties, there is still the implicit assumption that innovation, technological innovation, science, engineering, being smart and clever will decouple our societies from destructive impacts. So
growth essentially as well.
Yeah. So we're going to go from burning coal to produce electricity to generate electricity with a wind turbine or a solar panel. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence now that absolutely has displaced. So wind, wave, solar, other renewables has absolutely displaced certain energy generation in certain countries. United Kingdom is a pretty good example. United Kingdom has seen probably it's the fastest decarbonisation of electricity generation anywhere now, I think. And that's because basically coal collapsed. You know, we just don't burn coal to generate electricity. And the reason for that is because there was the dash for gas. And then also more recently, a significant increase in wind. So you can show there are examples, yeah. But of course, the job that we've got is to get the global economy to zero emissions. So not just to slow down the rate of increase of emissions, but to actually decrease them each and every year. And I think it's fair to say that renewables have not done that. They are largely augmenting energy production. And so what we need to do, I know this sounds obvious, and I feel kind of, whenever I make this point, I feel rather foolish for making it, because what we need to do is reduce coal, oil and gas use, right? Stop burning coal, oil and gas. And it kind of doesn't matter if you've trebled investments in wind, wave or solar, or trebled the deployment or capacity, if it doesn't happen at the same time as reducing coal, oil and gas. And for a long time now, we've been told that don't worry, it's going to happen, right? You've got exponential rates of solar. It will displace globally. And you can look at certain countries and it's happening, but it's not happening fast enough. And until we get those emissions down to zero, until we essentially stop burning coal and gas, we're going to continue to warm the climate. So there is this, I would argue, a very dangerous narrative that more of the same is going to do it for us, right? So all the problems that have been caused by industrial global capitalism will be solved by industrial globalized capitalism, which certainly requires a bit of a leap of faith right now.
And I think it kind of goes back to a point you were making earlier about, I don't know, the amount of transition that is needed is so great that it's kind of easier to believe these things, which are kind of leaps at the moment, before we kind of go, okay, we've actually got to do this big shift, whether it be, looking at kind of degrowth versions of the economy or eco-socialism or whatever. Like you've I think on your blog you've written about degrowth a little bit, or even a couple of events in it. How do you kind of come down on that as a framework of taking on climate? Because as we spoke in the intro, we've got Keir Starmer coming out with wanting Britain to have the top growth in the G7, which as growth hasn't really been on the table in the G7 for the last 5 years. I can understand where that's coming from, but is that the wrong direction? I asked like 3 questions there.
Yeah. So I think my interest, and I would hazard, I guess, many people's interest in post-growth or degrowth policy, is that if you really want to limit warming, if you really want to reduce impacts, then by insisting on 1%, 2%, 3% growth, you're kind of not just tying one hand, but both hands behind your back, because you necessarily limit all the different kind of things that you could do, all the different types of interventions or incentives are off the table because they would limit growth. I mean, it's still the case that for many policymakers, climate change is a kind of an optimization problem. What they want to do is not avoid dangerous climate change. They want to avoid dangerous economic degrowth, right? Yeah, and there is the potential for them to decarbonize too fast, because decarbonizing too fast for them would probably mean reducing fossil fuel use so that you would be reducing energy supply, which would throttle economic growth. It's what we've seen it kind of writ large, the kind of destabilizing impacts of limiting gas supply in Europe as a consequence of the Ukraine crisis. And so they are genuinely motivated to continue to grow the economies as fast as they can, given you can't go too fast because you've got inflationary pressures. And so there is such a thing as responding too quickly, and that too quickly for them is anything that would actually threaten economic growth. So you do have this quite surreal, if not bizarre, and mainstream assumption in climate economics, where there is almost an optimal amount of
damage,
climate change, right?
Yeah.
And because the job is not to avoid climate change, the job is to avoid impacts on the environment, impacts on the economy. And if you grow the economy sufficiently fast, then you can offset through adaptation or maybe future carbon removal all the kind of impacts that are happening now. So you end up this kind of this strange argument that we need to grow the economy in order to be able to afford to remove the carbon that comes from growing the economy by burning fossil fuels.
I'm just imagining like a man's house burning down, and he's about to go and call the fire service, and then his partner goes, "Wait, let's wait for the porch to burn down first, because then we could employ someone to rebuild the porch, and that'll be good for the economy." It's like that's essentially the way you've described what's going on.
However you want to rationalize, contextualize it, the assumption always is basically the economy must grow. Now, if you relax that assumption, and that could be in one of these integrated assessment models, these very quite complicated economic climate models, if you relax it, you can do just so many more things. There are just so many more routes to safety, because you don't continually have to continue energy consumption and material consumption. I mean, some people are talking about the ability to decarbonize the economy. So the United Kingdom, for example, yeah, we don't burn coal anymore, but also we don't really make much in terms of manufacturing. We're an information and services sector economy. And that means you're kind of dematerializing. You're able to generate economic goods and services and wealth, but without having to dig things out of the ground
And
and then
our
generate
Scope 3 emissions will be massive because of it, because of all the money we put everywhere else to get this stuff.
Yeah, but you offshore it, don't you? The workshops of the world, the China and the India and the South Korea. But it doesn't, when I was talking about the relative successes of the UK, it kind of doesn't matter. What matters is what the global economy is doing. And if the UK is a country within a global industrialized kind of capitalist system, its continual demand for goods and services which are going to produce emissions elsewhere, it doesn't matter if they're in, Birmingham or, Beijing or Bangkok, right?
Yeah.
So in summary to what's proved to be quite a very long and rambling answer, the degrowth scholars are, I think, increasing in their sense of legitimacy and the willingness for some politicians, for some policymakers, and also for some banks, central banks, to actually listen to what it is they've been saying for quite a long time, which is you just can't decouple fast enough, and that you need to be much more flexible and open-minded about the role of policymakers or central banks in a global economic system that needs to undertake really, really urgent reform. And if you insist on imposing growth burdens and debt-fueled growth on, for the next 5, 10, 50, or even 100 years, you're just not going to get there in time.
Yeah. James, I just want for the final question. So you've given us a sort of a view of the future where we kick the can down the road, we put all our eggs into one basket, which is carbon capture. It doesn't work out, and so then we go on to geoengineering. Yeah, and once you go to geoengineering, well, it's a roll of a dice which way we can go. So, but in your more hopeful moments, James, what could you, just to end the show, in your more hopeful moments, what could you see as an alternative to that if the world was to take the climate crisis as serious as it should do in the next 50 years?
Well, in a world, it would be solidarity. It would be solidarity for people who are separated from us in space. So people who experience climate change with massively different exposures and vulnerability, and also people who are separated from us in time, because the things that we're doing now are going to impact people not just for hundreds of years, but thousands of years. The changes that we're putting in place in the climate are essentially irreversible on human timescales. At the moment, there is this, for various reasons, and some of which we touched on, in just that previous discussion, an assumption that we'll be able to decouple and increase the size of the pie for everyone, right? So you mentioned earlier Kate Raworth and donut economics.
Yeah.
And that's probably a framework that gives me an awful lot of hope, because I've been amazed by how successful Kate has been to get people to seriously consider it, given the implications, because the implications are of fundamental solidarity in even redistribution. Because if you want to get everybody up into that social foundation, if you want everyone to have decent lives, maybe everyone to be able to achieve living in accordance to the sustainable development goals, so good jobs, access to energy, everyone to have good lives in which they can flourish, at the same time as reducing our impacts, then what you can't do is just assume it's Ferraris for all. You just can't assume that you're going to see 3% increase in the size of the global economy forever. So, you're going to have an economy that's 4 times larger, 5 times larger, 10 times larger. The rate of decoupling just won't do it. And so what Kate did is establish that, well, that means you've got to share, right? That means some people, and it's still quite a small fraction of humanity, the richest 1%, richest 10%, have got to rein in their impacts. So they've got to stop flying everywhere. They've got to stop eating so much meat. They've got to stop having so many second or additional homes, and so many large homes. And they need to redistribute the resources they've got in order to allow those people who can barely get by, or maybe not even getting by at all, decent lives. And that means the redistribution of, yes, money in some places. So loss and damages at the last COP was an important principle, but also that redistribution of capability and technologies. They can leapfrog an awful lot of the fossil fuel mistakes that we made in the global north. So, go straight to solar, go straight to decentralized energy generation, go straight to mobile networks. And somehow we need to do that in a world which is still driven in terms of politics by nation state dynamics, where we've literally got nations at war throwing bombs at each other. So you wanted an answer about hope. So I won't talk about the potential destabilizing impacts of climate change, but I will talk about my innate faith in humanity, and that when we can see that our future is necessarily a collective future, that we don't have a future of isolation and nationalism, that a future in which we think we can maintain our security is one in which we cower behind razor wire and private armies, or a military industrial complex which essentially now rules the world. When you give people the opportunity to craft a world which is based on solidarity, which is based on sharing, and which is based on a world which we can all have good lives indefinitely, lives that are in balance with the earth system, and a deeper appreciation of the wonders and the beauty that we've got already, and that we don't need to manufacture that wonder. It's literally for free if you just go up and look at the night sky, right? That these are the messages and these are the values that I think universally people understand, because they're about what it is to be a human. And what it is to be a human is to care deeply about other people, to have meaningful relationships, meaningful work, have a sense of purpose. And I can't think of anything more important to do with my life than to think about the ways that I could bring that sort of world into being.
Well, a fantastic way to end the show. James, you've been a great guest. Really appreciate your time tonight and for coming on.
Well, many thanks. That was a really lovely discussion. Thanks.
This is the part of the show that's dedicated to the fighters, the healers and the conservers of the world that are doing their bit for all of us. It's the shout out. James, who have you got for us this week, mate?
I've got two people who are putting their liberty on the line for climate justice.
Okay,
right.
Yeah, who are they?
Okay, the first person is a young fellow called Edred Whittingham. He is a student at the university which I teach. That's the University of Exeter. And Edred also happens to be a member of Just Stop Oil. And Edred has been getting into awful lots of trouble recently by trying to raise awareness around the climate crisis. He has been in jail quite a bit. He is currently in the middle of a number of legal actions and trials, and will probably be going to jail and maybe prison for who knows how long. And certainly for me, he is one of my climate heroes. And the other climate hero I've got is somebody else who has been taking direct non-violent action, and that's Ali Rowe, who was one of the founder members of Extinction Rebellion and the role of medics and health professionals in the climate crisis. And Ali is currently facing a trial for a direct action that she and a group of medics made against JP Morgan. They sort of accidentally on purpose broke their windows in a protest. And she and those people felt compelled to take that action because they just couldn't stand by and watch a massive organization such as JP Morgan continue to make billions of dollars through financing fossil fuels and therefore the eradication of young people's future. So those are the two people that I'd like to give a shout out.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, big shout out to them. We always condone smashing windows where appropriate on this show.
Always wear goggles.
Thank you, James, and a big thank you to everyone that is listening. And remember, if you're helping the planet in any way, we love you, we appreciate you, and we hope you join us again next time. Take care, everyone.
Bye. We'd like to say a massive thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon, with a special shout out to Lizzie, Jill Burke, Kaylee Woods Hartley and Guillermont. If you'd like to join these amazing people and support the show, head to patreon.com/GND Media UK. And if you can't afford to help us out, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much.